We'll just have a smile every time we hear
that. Yeah, every time that noise happens.
Doing it again.
And wait until somebody points out to you on the chat that it keeps going off.
I'll say, oh no, I've not noticed. I didn't know that was happening.
Must be your end.
Yes, it's fine over here. Oh, looking great, sounding good. Chris Russell.
That's Chris. He's one of my colleagues. Thanks, Chris.
That's good. We've not started yet, and he's saying we're looking good and sounding great.
Don't have to worry about your hair, Emma. You know, fixing your hair clearly worked.
Phew. Right. Okay. I think we'll give it one more minute, and then we'll make a start.
Yep. Fine by me.
I've unfortunately spilt my water like on the floor near my feet, so I'm just lifting my feet up now so I don't end up paddling.
That might explain why your internet's cutting in and out.
The whole thing might blow up in a second. Tom Brooker, I agree, all looking and sounding good.
It's another of my lovely supportive colleagues.
Oh, I'm not being funny, Izzy, but no, none of my colleagues ever say that about me. I don't get any of that. Right, okay. We've given everyone, oh, okay, all right, thank you.
I didn't know those people, so that's good.
I had to dig them out of you all, but... Teresa said it as well. Amanda said it. Oh, there we go.
Everyone said it.
Amazing. We feel amazing. Let's make a start. So welcome everyone to our 9th in the conversation with. I'm delighted to say this is with Dr Izzie Lathom. My name is Emma Smith. I'm the project manager for Empowered Conversations, which is a project of 6 Degrees over in Salford. The comments are just coming so fast now, it's just making me giggle. So I'm going to just hand over to Izzie to introduce herself.
Hello everyone, I'm Izzie Lathom, and I'm lovely supported today by my colleagues from ADS who started you all going on the chat nice and early. That's good. I'm a senior lecturer from the Association for Dementia Studies at the University of Worcester. And today I'm going to be talking to you about what was my PhD study, which looked at learning in care homes.
Brilliant, thanks Izzie. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a plan for today. Thank you, Barbara, always supportive. So Izzie will do a presentation. We will then come back and have a little chat about that, and I already know that you're going to be really chatty today, so at the bottom of your screen you'll see something called a Q&A. If you've got some questions about anything that you've heard Izzie say, or any comments that you want to pop in, please feel free to get them in there. Just put them in at any time, don't feel that you have to do it at the end, just put them in straight away. I know my computer's making a little noise, it'll stop in a minute, I promise. I'll tell you a little bit about Empowered Conversations. So we deliver communication courses across Greater Manchester for family carers and also professionals working with people with dementia. We also have another project called Empowered Carers who deliver one-to-one support for carers via Zoom. So we've been doing Zoom for they've been doing Zoom for quite a while now. Since COVID came in, we have moved a lot of our stuff online like other services. The seminars are one of the things that we've done, but we've also had other sort of engaging events happening. So we have a disco, we do some drawing online, we have a creative session, we have the wonderful Come and Sing session, and we do some group work as well with family carers and also people with dementia. So I am going to, I think, hand over to Izzie. So as I said, Q&A's at the bottom. Just whack in your questions now, because it's always nice that when we finish the presentation and we've had a nat that we've got some questions to kick us off with. Okay, Izzie, I'm going to hand over to you.
Excellent, thank you. And I shall attempt to share my screen. There we go. So that should appear for you, hopefully. Yeah, I'm getting a nod from Emma, so that's good. So, thank you all for coming on this rainy day. I'm glad that I've managed to beat the rain in terms of importance this afternoon. So hopefully I'll be able to keep your interest. As I said, I'm going to be talking to you today about the findings from my PhD research, which was particularly looking at how care workers in care homes learn to care for people living with dementia. Obviously, I know that we've probably got people on the call from lots of different backgrounds. So not just from that care home sector, maybe from other professional backgrounds, and also people living at home, living with dementia themselves. I think there's things that everybody should be able to take away from this, and I'll try to sort of remember to pull some of those out as we go through. But obviously, as Emma said, there's that Q&A at the bottom of the screen there, so feel free to jump in and we can bring some of those out towards the end as well. So the title of the presentation and really of the findings overall is "What Works is What Matters." And you're going to sort of uncover why that's the title and why that really sums up this whole process of learning that people will go through as we go through the presentation. So first of all, at the top there, the question that my PhD study sought to answer was, how do care workers in care homes learn to care for people living with dementia? And first off, I think it's probably helpful to kind of know why I in particular wanted to answer that question. There's lots of kind of academic reasons why that question needed to be answered, but actually, certainly for me, kind of my own passion and my own interest is what kind of drew me there. My background many years ago now, far more years ago now than I care to think about, I actually started my career as a care worker in care homes. So that was where I first encountered people living with dementia and first learnt my practice, if you like. And I know from that time that the practice that I learned, both good and bad, was the product of much more than the training that I had. It was a product of all the things that were going on around me and in me during that time. And ever since then, that's a topic that's fascinated me and continued to fascinate me throughout my career, about how complex that issue actually is. And then when I moved on from that care worker role, I moved into more sort of training and teaching of people doing health and social care work, and later on into research in that field, tending to specialise and stay working with care homes because it's where my heart really lies. But that experience and those that understanding of the complexity of the work that goes on there and how difficult it is to change practice and improve practice stayed with me throughout that teaching and that researching. That often we can make it sound like it's an awful lot simpler than it actually is. And I suppose if there's one thing that sums up my motivation to do this study, it's probably that kind of little quote there up in the corner. It's my most hated phrase that I hear an awful lot in my job. That, well, it's not rocket science, is it? I hear that an awful lot about care work, about dementia care. And I disagree with it quite profoundly. Actually, in my experience, good care work, getting good experiences for people living with dementia and their families in all sorts of settings is a form of rocket science. It takes some really special people and it takes some real special skills. And I don't think we do those people or the people who need that care and need that support any services when we try to downplay it and make it sound much simpler than it is. Because that life at that coalface of care work is much more complex than is often credited. And I can be guilty of simplifying it sometimes too. And I also think that care workers in particular are often unheard in a sea of voices of great advice and great expertise about what needs to change. And when you actually spend time with those care workers, talking to them about the work they do and the people they support, they often have great insight into what can change and what should change. And actually, I think sort of the current news cycle, what's going on in the news currently, I won't get too political on you, don't worry, but I think that perhaps shows some of that dichotomy there, that we've had some truly amazing and humbling work being done over the last few months in care homes and in other sectors to care for people during this crisis. And yet, you know, very quickly the discussion has moved on to trying to belittle that and trying to make that far less than it's actually been. So I think there's that real kind of personal and sort of personal passion behind what I wanted to look at as well. But there's also quite an important sort of academic and reason that I wanted to look at it as well. Because when you initially look at that question of how do care workers in care homes learn to care, you might initially think that we've got the answer to that, because there's actually an awful lot of stuff out there that looks at how important training is. And that makes sense when you think of the care field over the last 20 or so years that's moved from a sector that was completely unregulated to one that is now fairly regulated, a workforce that does have sort of minimum training requirements and does have far more expectations around it than ever used to be the case. However, when you actually delve into that evidence and the reality of what is going on, what we see is that there's a very complex relationship between training and education provision for care workers and care quality and good outcomes for people living with dementia. So it's a relationship, and it's one that's important, but it's not quite as simple as saying the more training you provide, the better the quality gets. However, there is a really kind of strong rhetoric that training's the answer. So every time there's a problem, every time we see one of the horrible scandals that we see, or any time, you know, an issue is identified, the immediate answer is to say staff need more training, rather than perhaps saying maybe this issue is a little bit more complicated and maybe we need to start speaking to that complexity rather than looking for the simplest solution every time. Because the simplest solution sometimes feels like the simplest solution because what it does is put all the responsibility on the people at the coalface, rather than maybe looking at the system as more of a whole and what can change there. And when you look at research that's been done in different workplaces, so not care homes and not necessarily sort of health or social care settings, what you start to see is actually a very, very different picture. And there's a fair bit of research in that field. And what that tells us is that learning occurs in other ways. Yes, training happens, but actually the most influential things on the practice day to day is what is going on in the interactions, the relationships, the work type, the activities that are going on between colleagues with the work that they're doing every day. And it's only when you start to understand that you can actually start to really change and really influence the learning that is taking place. And for me, when you put that together with what person-centered care is, that goal that we're aiming for supporting people living with dementia and helping people to live well, actually those two things fit really well together. Person-centered care is social by nature. It's about relationships. It's about me relating to you and you relating to me, and all the other things that are going on in our lives that actually affect the way we relate to each other today. And it's about the way we communicate to each other and the way we understand each other's communication. And those happens, particularly in a workplace, that relationship and that communication happens within the boundaries of that workplace. And so actually for me, there was a really strong connection between this idea of informal learning that's going on day to day in the sort of day-to-day hustle and bustle of work, and the core of what we're trying to get to when we're talking about good person-centered care. And that actually there was maybe a bit of a gap in the jigsaw, and that we needed to connect that side of things to what we know about training and trying to improve care quality. So that's kind of really why my study set out as it did. So mostly today, the rest of it, I'm going to focus on the findings because that's the kind of interesting stuff and the really useful stuff. But just so that you know where they came from, because it can be helpful to kind of know where the data came from, who it was coming from. This, the research I did took place in 2 care homes. So one was a nursing home and one was a residential home. And I'll tell you a little bit more about them in a second. It was a research style called ethnographic research, which basically means you spend lots of time in a setting getting to know it, like you live there, like you work there. So basically, in each of those homes, I spent 6 months, one after the other, and I spent about 2 or 3 days a week across those 6 months, chatting with staff, spending time in the communal areas, reading and looking at documents and notice boards and plans for new buildings, observing what was going on, using some general observation and also some very specific tools with people living with dementia, and interviewing people as well. So interviewing was particularly with staff, whereas when I was just generally chatting, that might well have included residents as well, because many of the residents that were part of the study, because they were living with dementia and were needing the kind of support that was needed in a care home, they may well have found it very difficult to have engaged in a more conventional interview. But actually chatting and telling me what their day had been like was something that some people could do. And for other people, they'd be more able to tell me what was going on for them through me observing what was going on for them and how their behaviour might be communicating to me or saying whether something's right or wrong for them. So that's where the data came from. And on this slide, I've just got 2 quotes here, just to show you the difference between the care homes that I visited. Now, all the names that you'll see on any of these slides are all pseudonyms, so you won't be able to recognise these homes. They were fortuitously actually really quite contrasted. I didn't set out looking for that, but they ended up being that, which was quite handy from a research perspective. So Strauss Hill Court was a residential home, and they described themselves as specialising in dementia care. And the quote you've got there is actually a quote from my observation notes, which really kind of, it summed up what my experience for most of the time there was like. So in this particular situation, I'd explained to a member of staff that I'd received an unexpected hug from a resident called Keith. The staff member said, well, welcome to Strauss Hill, you're in it now. And to me, my reflection on that was that this let me know that that was normal here, and that actually it felt like I passed an initiation. It felt like I now belonged there. So Strauss Hill generally was a really positive experience for me as a researcher, and generally the care that I saw there was pretty person-centred. They had their ups and downs, but it was pretty person-centred. Sunshine Lodge was a nursing home, and they specialised in end-of-life care, but they didn't specialise in dementia care, and they were very open about that. And particularly because they specialised in end-of-life care, they had quite a high turnover of residents, because they would take people sort of in the last few weeks and months of their life. So it changed somewhat of the dynamics of what was going on there. And this was an example of again, quite a typical interaction I experienced in the home. That quite quickly, I became aware that my interactions with residents positioned me as quite different to many of the care staff. So, for example, when I responded to a resident by asking a staff member for something that the resident had asked for, who was quite distressed, I was just told that other people just didn't bother to answer that resident in question. And that response to me, my reflection was that it made me feel like I'd broken a basic rule. And so that really summed up, it made it was much harder for me to have relationships with the care staff in that home. And again, you know, these were not care staff who were terrible people, and the physical care in particular in this home was top notch. But from a person-centred perspective, and particularly around dementia care, some of those more emotional and social elements were certainly not as person-centred as was going on in the other home. But what was really noticeable from this sort of comparison between the two homes was that what emerged was that they both had exactly the same learning processes going on in them, but they ended up in different outcomes. And that actually tells us something really important. It tells us that what is going on in that care home is really, really influential, which those of us in the field kind of knew in our guts, but we've actually now got some evidence to tell us what is happening and how it's happening, which means we can now influence it. So, onto the good stuff, onto the findings. So, This is an attempt to explain lots of different bits in kind of on one slide, but I'm going to talk through each of the bits. So don't worry too much if it feels a little bit overwhelming for you at this point. What you'll see in the middle there with the little stick person, that's your care worker. That's your care worker who every day, in everything that they engage with, is having to decide what they're going to do in any situation, whether it's a thing they've done before, whether it's a new situation, whether they want to try something new, whether they're working with a new colleague. Every day they're having to decide what action to take, what solution to take to a problem. So every day they're potentially engaged in learning. And they learn when they're deciding, I'm either going to take this thing I've done, it worked, and I'm going to take it forward, I'm going to tell other people about it, I'm going to do it again, or actually it didn't work and I'm not going to do it again, and I'm going to tell other people not to do it again. So they're engaged in this every day, and that's the blue bit. That's your what works is what matters process. So that's this learning mechanism that is going on all day, every day. And there's a number of different types of what works is what matters that's going on there, and I'll talk about those in a little bit, and they're the other blue sections there. But whilst that worker is engaging in that what works in what matters process, they're drawing on skills and knowledge that they've either got in their head or that they've got at other times in their careers or their lives, and that's the stuff in green. And they're actually listed there in order of influence from least to most. And you can see they kind of actually get bigger. So they draw on their personal resources, and we'll look at what they are in a second. Interestingly, and I was really excited to see this come out, really pleased from a person-centered care point of view, they draw on resident influences as well. And I think this is a place that we could really, really improve the way that we help workers learn, and could translate this across to lots of different settings and situations. They also draw on what I call care home cultural knowledge. And those of you that know anything about this setting will know that we hear a lot about care home culture. And one of the things this study has helped us to do is to see one of the very specific processes that shows us why culture is so influential, because it actually helps to reinforce the learning that's taking place. And there are a couple of things there, the things that are there in orange, that actually feed into that cultural knowledge, which again, I'll come to in a second. So we'll start with the blue. So this is that everyday learning mechanism that's going on. And it's called what works is what matters, because that's a phrase I heard loads from the care workers when I would say, well, how do you know what to do? Or how did you decide that was the right thing to do? Or what would you do next time? They would constantly say, well, you know, I just do what works. And it worked last time, so I'll try it again this time. And there are different ways that they kind of try out what works. They do it through seeing results. They do it through negotiating conflicting pressures, and they do it through being thrown in at the deep end. And I think if we've got any care workers on the call, that last one's probably ringing quite a significant bell for you right now, because it certainly does for me. What I'm doing when I go about my daily work is I'm learning when I see what result it has. Now, that result could be about the result it has for residents, and particularly for the care homes I was in, that was about avoiding negative emotions for residents. There was a real focus on avoiding negative emotions. Some trying to increase positive emotions, but a particular focus on those negative emotions. At other times, it was actually about, does it get us a result in terms of fulfilling the expectations of my role? And then at other times, there was a sense of trial and error that actually I need to experiment a bit here and see what works in relation to getting a result for the resident or expectations. And the two quotes on this slide are from each care home, and they actually really illustrate a big difference between the two homes. So seeing results for residents was really, really prominent at Strauss Hill. And that's one of the reasons why they had far more person-centered care. And this was a quote from one of the care workers there. And she was saying, well, when you get somebody who's, you know, really moody, bad tempered, and then you get that smile or that cuddle, that's the best day in the world. You go home thinking, I've done something. You might not get it for another month, but it's so important, just that smile. And actually that was something she used as kind of a guiding principle for how she worked out whether this was the right thing that she should do again, or actually whether this was the wrong thing that she shouldn't do again. But that other quote at the bottom there is from Sunshine Lodge, and their learnings, their staff's learning, seem to be far more about seeing results in relation to fulfilling expectations about their role. So in this home, there was constant talk about how busy care workers were and about how they never sat down, and they didn't ever sit down. It was hard to ever have anything other than a grabbed conversation in a corridor with them. And then I was sort of mulling this over, and then I saw this written on the notice board in the home in response to a quality assurance survey that had been fed back from a family member. And the manager had responded with this quote: "I can assure you that my staff are never sitting down doing nothing. They're all working really hard, but it's impossible to provide one-to-one care." And it really made me think, actually, what influence does that have on what care workers learn is the right thing to be doing here? Actually, that sends a message that the result I need to see is to fulfill this expectation that I'm really, really busy all the time, and that I don't have the time to sit down, even when actually maybe sitting down is what the resident might really need and might be what I really need as a worker. So a really interesting contrast between the two homes. And that third element of seeing results around trial and error is particularly important because it stood out, particularly around dementia care as opposed to care more generally. Because what a lot of care workers were saying was that because dementia is so complex, people are complex anyway, and then you add dementia into the mix, that actually you have to go into every situation with an approach that says, I'm just going to have to try and see. And you've got to be okay with the fact that you might not get it right first time, and your colleagues have got to be okay with the fact that you might not get it right first time. And actually that means how we facilitate that becomes quite important. In terms of sort of negotiating those conflicting pressures, this was really staff were recognising that just a part of their job was that often they were facing things where they couldn't do the right thing. There wasn't one right thing, there were two right things, and they had to make the decision. And sometimes that was around resources and needs. And sometimes it was around this kind of interpretation of expectations, this idea that everyone should have one-to-one care, but that actually there wasn't enough people around to do one-to-one care, and that they constantly considered part of their job about having to make these judgments. And then finally, there's this idea that actually part of care work, and particularly dementia care work, is just about being thrown in the deep end. And that there's a sense in which you just have to get stuck in, and that's a characteristic that actually makes you pretty good at the job and good at learning the job. There are always going to be unpredictable situations, and that especially at the beginning, that's how a lot of workers feel. So this was sort of the picture of that day-to-day learning process. And what I was able to do from that, and from a lot of the other data that was collected around that, is actually to start thinking, so what do you need to think about? If you own a care home, or if you're running education courses for care home workers, or you're a family member and you're looking maybe for a possible care home for respite, or you know, you're trying to think about how you can influence your field. These are some of the things that you really need to be thinking about. And one is to actually be questioning quite deeply what our definitions of success actually are. What is seen as a good outcome? Not what do we say in our mission statement is a good outcome, what's actually seen every day as a good outcome. Is that directly related to resident well-being? Is it about Mrs. So-and-so having a smile on her face? Or actually is it about achieving certain expectations? Because if it's about the latter, that is what people will learn, because that's how the process works. So we need to be thinking about, how do we actually talk about success? What is success for this resident, for that resident, for this situation, for that resident? We also need to be actually very open and identify the conflicting pressures that care workers feel they have to negotiate. Because certainly the impression from the care homes I was in was that it was very much a case that the care workers all knew they had to deal with this, but nobody ever mentioned it. Managers sort of maybe didn't talk about the fact that, well, yeah, we don't have this piece of equipment that they're supposed to be using, but the care workers have to make a decision. And actually, that's not fair to people on the ground. You know, as managers, as organisations, there needs to be support to say, how do we make those decisions? And actually, how do we make those decisions in a person-centred way, rather than leaving it up to an individual? We also need to be thinking about, how do we facilitate day-to-day discussion and reflection? So how can we make sure that reflecting on the tasks and the problems and resident experiences is not just something we do on a training course, is not just something we do at patient review or resident review, it's actually something we do every day. And actually, do we encourage that experimentation and trial and error? You know, how much do we support people getting it wrong? Because if we're saying that's actually a really important part of dementia care, then we need to be getting the situation around it to make sure that's happening safely for everybody and that we're getting really good outcomes out of it. And I think there's also something there about making the deep end shallower and actually saying, yeah, there probably are unpredictable situations here. This is the kind of job that you get thrown in, and that people who like that kind of situation are going to thrive. But actually, let's talk about the problem solving and the dilemmas that we face every day. Let's encourage the critical reflection. Let's make it normal where we say what didn't work, what did work, rather than actually kind of pretending everything's smooth all the time, which sometimes I think a lot of care workers feel like they have to present that front, and that doesn't help them to learn in a successful way. So that's that sort of the blue bit, the kind of meat and potatoes of the everyday learning. So now we'll move on to some of those influences that are coming in, a little bit simpler. And this, as I said, this was the really exciting one from my point of view. And I think this is the one that we as educators, as people that sort of try to influence the practice that happens in lots of different sectors, could really do an awful lot more about. Because this is a lot more than saying person-centred care is about relationships. This is about recognising that residents and clients, people living with dementia, are part of the learning process themselves. So care workers learned from residents. So this was like indirect personal feedback in interactions, through putting their choices and preferences into action, and also to a lesser extent based on what they knew about residents. So what they got from things like care plans or stories that were told about from their family members. And the quote that you've got here is probably my favourite one from the whole study. This is the one that I would like to bottle and hand to anybody who tells me that care work isn't rocket science. Because when you start to dig down into this, and certainly when you were there talking to this girl and seeing her do her work, this is rocket science. So she was talking about a lady called Julia, who they had lots of worries about keeping her weight up, because she walked a lot, she was very busy, she never sat down for meals. But she was describing, you know, how she'd worked out, how she'd learned how to care for Julia around her eating. And she said, I recently discovered that she'll eat porridge, which I didn't know because everybody just gave her cornflakes. But I gave her a bowl of porridge, plenty of sweetener, jam, and 2 bowls. Not saying she will next time, but you know, and you know, I know that you can't give Julia a hot drink, because as soon as you give it to her, she'll just put it down because it's too hot. So you've got to make it differently. If it's just warm, she'll drink it. And it's so easy to dismiss that as, oh, it's just making a cup of tea, isn't it? But this is somebody who had knowledge like that for 35 residents in her head, and she put it into action 20 times a day for every single one of them, and changed it every day if needs be. And I can barely remember one colleague's coffee order from my office to the kitchen, you know. and actually having the creativity to think, oh, hang on, yeah, well, the reason she doesn't drink it is because it's too hot. And maybe her dementia means she's forgotten the cups there by the time it's cooled down enough. That's a skill. And actually, they're the skills that we need to be encouraging and really celebrating in the work. And these are the things that I think we don't always capture very well. So some of the things I think we could think about in this area is how important it is to actually maximize staff, or whoever you're thinking about their learning, the varied experiences of residents across time and activity. Actually, are residents being encountered in lots of different situations, times of day, and with different intent? Because that's when you start to really learn who that person is. One of the things that stands out to me in the other care home in Sunshine Lodge, there were two workers who started halfway through the study, and they were both, they just started the care certificate at this time, which meant they weren't allowed to be doing care. They had to be following other people, or the home had decided they had to be. And they spent, on the day I was observing, they literally just followed one other member of staff for the whole of that day. And I was at a point in the research where I was starting to think about some of those ideas and play around with what would I be doing differently. And one of the questions I started to ask myself is, why are those members of staff following one member of staff around all day rather than one resident around all day? Because actually those members of staff would learn the same things by following a resident around all day. They'd learn how to help somebody up with a hoist, how to help somebody on and off the toilet, but they would also learn what that day experience was like for that resident and how different things impacted on that resident. And I think that links to that second point there, is actually making sure that staffs understand how all the different roles fit together for people's resident experience, not just their own. That actually, if you're 5 minutes late getting somebody up and dressed, doesn't mean they're now late to the prayer session, in which case that's a big deal. And if you don't know that, then that needs to be changed. We need to think about how we actually represent resident feedback in reflective activities and discussions that we have, and not just the ticks in the care plan that things have been done that are supposed to have been done, not just our resident reviews, but actually in handovers, you know, is Mary getting to say whether she's had a good day or not, however Mary might be saying that to us. I think we also need to think more carefully about how we help and skill staff to observe and interpret resident behaviour. And that's particularly important for those with more advanced dementia, because otherwise there is, and there certainly was in the study, the likelihood that those people become lost compared with those that are more able to communicate verbally or through behaviour how they're particularly feeling. And I think there's a sobering bit of advice there at the bottom, is not to overestimate the importance of care plans. My study, care plans came up a lot, but when I looked at the data and kind of counted where it was coming up, care plans only came up in data that came from senior care staff who wrote the care plans. They didn't come up in the data from the staff who were supposed to be reading the care plans, which tells us something. They're important, but perhaps not as significant to learning as we might think. Okay, so personal resources. And this is something that we know a fair bit about already, actually. We know that actually people draw on their work and their life experiences and their personal values in the work that they do. And therefore, thinking about who we're recruiting is important. It's not the be all and end all. I think there is a group of people in the middle who actually can be brilliant in brilliant environments and less brilliant in less brilliant environments. But it's recognising that this is something that is there and that people will be drawing on this. And you've got a quote there from a care worker about how he thinks about somebody who might find it very difficult to ask for help or need help on and off the toilet, for example. But I think in terms of the things to think about, what we're really looking at here is that we need to be better at really drawing out what we mean by things like common sense and the taken for granted knowledge. When we see those standout examples of good or poor practice, we need to be taking the times with individuals and teams to actually draw out why they occurred. what is the tacit knowledge, so that's the knowledge that we're drawing on but don't know we're drawing on it, that has actually led to that. So in the previous example with the care worker and Julia, that care worker didn't really have any insight, any conscious insight into how awesome she was. It actually took quite a lot of, you know, drawing out, but why are you doing that and other people aren't, to actually get her to understand how that was, and therefore that was probably worth sharing with her colleagues and talking to other people about. Now what we're doing is getting into the bits that were in orange. So these are the bits that feed into cultural knowledge. And this was the biggest thing that those workers draw on. And the reason they draw on it is because it's ever present. And the reason it's ever present is because of their interactions with their colleagues. So as well as engaging in those all day, every day learning processes, they're interacting with their colleagues all day, every day. And so that is being drawn in constantly. And there's kind of a feedback loop that takes place. And so there are 4 ways that, that sort of the interactions with colleagues influence workers' learning. So that's through being formally shown and told. So there was that process of shadowing at the beginning. And there was also an element of senior instruction most days, usually through something like handover, sometimes more informally, depending on the approach of the manager. There's also a process of asking and being given advice. So this was where a worker might choose to seek out somebody else who was on duty to ask advice from, or a worker might choose to point someone else in the right direction. The key thing about that one is that there is the workers choose who they're engaging with there. So their interpersonal relationships, how well they get on with their colleagues, really, really matter. So you can be the best care worker in the world, but if the way you challenge your fellow care workers means they don't listen to a word you say, you're not going to influence their learning. Whereas if you're somebody who can get others on side, you're far more likely to influence their learning. And that's very important when we're talking about trying to change cultures in particular in care homes. And the exchange there that's from Strauss Hill Court, I think really illustrates one of the positives that was going on between the colleagues in this home, because essentially there's a challenge there about what's gone on. So staff member A and V had this exchange when one of them took the mug away from a resident, and V said to A, who was her senior, so V was the more junior colleague here, and she said, well, would it be better to let her finish? There's only a mouthful left. And staff member A replied, yeah, and returned the cup to the resident and said jokingly to the resident, I've been told off. And I reflected on that it actually seems okay to challenge and suggest at this home. And that was repeated several times. And that actually they had relationships amongst each other there that meant they learned from each other and could challenge each other and kept each other on their toes. In interactions with colleagues, they also observe each other as well. So watch what other people are doing and copy what other people are doing. And again, those personal relationships between colleagues matter. So if it's somebody I respect, I'm far more likely to watch what they're doing and copy what they're doing than if it's somebody I've got a personal beef with. Again, regardless of maybe how they're actually doing their care. And there are also elements of communication and shorthand that matter here. So there's some things around how we actually communicate what the expectations of care worker is, and we mentioned that a little bit earlier. There's a lot of shorthand that gets used in care work. The one I noticed the most is the phrase do. So I'm going to do Mrs. Jones. I'm going to do Mr. Jones. I'm going to do whatever. And actually in Strauss Hill Court, where there was more person-centred care, whilst there was that shorthand, there was also an awful lot of explaining what that shorthand meant. Whereas in Sunshine Lodge, there was just that shorthand, which actually meant you were transmitting an awful lot of unsaid information with that phrase. And that meant that non-person-centred practices crept in. And there were also elements of the environment that actually communicated things unintentionally. So in Strauss Hill Court, the whole home was very open, and residents part of their mobility, because it was a residential home, could go anywhere throughout the home. So every member of staff had to know every resident. Whereas in Sunshine Lodge, because people's mobility was far more impaired, and because there were far less communal areas, actually staff only really knew residents in terms of small groups, and residents only knew staff in terms of small groups, which meant they weren't necessarily getting a breadth of experience and a breadth of knowledge. So in terms of the things that would need to be thought about there, think about how we organise work teams and tasks so that people are encountering lots of different colleagues. It's thinking about how we address the interpersonal skills, actually team building, communication, critical reflection. How do we give constructive feedbacks? Actually, are those characteristics that we reward? I think organisations should be thinking about how they skill in individuals in teams to facilitate reflective practice, to function around critical thinking and reflection around everyday and incidents that occur. And I think it's also important to have a think about the language that's used in everyday care work, and to address shorthand that may be happening just as habit throughout that day to day. And the final feature that came into that culture, we are near the end, now aware of time, Emma, don't panic, was actually around training. So far less influential than interactions with colleagues. And I know as somebody who does education as a living, there's a certain element of threat there for me. This doesn't mean that training isn't important. What it means is that we need to be far more sophisticated in how we think about it. What came out of this study is that training was important, but only in certain ways. So there were certain tasks that were called essentially gatekeeper tasks. And what they were things that without the training, you couldn't be a care worker. So essentially we're talking about manual handling, and then for senior workers, we're talking about medication training. And what these meant were, I experienced this because I was, when you're a researcher, you try to be really helpful because that's when people like you and talk to you and want you to be there. But there were a lot of times where actually I experienced, because I hadn't got my manual handling training, where, I'd be being helpful and then it would be, oh, well, you're no use, I've got to go and find somebody who can actually help. And so I was immediately kind of shut back from being a care worker and being able to be engaged in that way. And that communicates something about what makes someone a care worker and doesn't make someone a care worker. And I'm not sure that's actually the message we want to be sending about what makes someone a care worker and not a care worker. The perception of staff was very much that training was more about knowing the job rather than caring. And again, I think that's significant. Doesn't mean that training's not important, but it does mean we need to be thinking about how we're training. And those sorts of things. And how it's applied makes a big difference. So at Strauss Hill Court, there was a lot more effort in thinking about who went on training, when, and what happened when they came back than there was at Sunshine Lodge. Sunshine Lodge, they had all in-house training. Everybody had an hour out of the middle of their 12-hour shift, and they went into a room, did some training and came back out and then went back on shift again. So there was a lot more thought about it at Strauss Hill Court. And so I think training was affecting practice, not perhaps as influentially as we would like, but it was certainly having an impact. But again, I think what that means we need to think about is that we've got to activate our training, or the things we want training to make a difference, through those regular reflective activities and through that informal what works is what matters process. So we need to be bringing out the stuff from training in trial and error, in the negotiating, and we need to be referencing those in our training as well. And I think, as I said at the beginning there, we need to be having some hard thoughts about what our gatekeeper tasks actually are. So do we include dementia-specific skills in that? So are we saying you can't be considered a dementia care worker unless you're doing communication and interpreting behaviour training of some kind that's affecting your learning? Are we thinking about interpersonal skills as actually being absolutely essential to being a care worker? And if so, then they need to be gatekeeper tasks of one way or another. So some things to think about. So just in terms of what next, I've said the first one already. The second one, I think we need to recognise that there are opportunities every day to help learning and to influence learning, but we don't make the best use of them. Relationships and communication matter to learning. They're embedded in every single one of those things that we've spoken about. They're not outcomes of learning. They come beforehand, and actually that's why training like empowered conversations provide, and some of the more person-centered training that exists is so important, because it's about building that relationship and communication to start with. We need to consider the influence of structural factors, so how we organise our teams and workloads and the space, on actually how they shape the opportunities that exist for learning. And I'm in the process of kind of coming up with plans for how to develop kind of resources for care homes, for staff, educators, and for families as well. And there might be some ideas from the guys on the line, you know, about what they might like to see. So I'd be really happy to hear some of those. I'm really sorry, because I know I went on much longer than I was supposed to. I really like this topic. I shall stop sharing my screen and then pass back over to Emma.
That was brilliant, Izzie. You've given us absolutely loads to think about, and don't apologise, because I was certainly engrossed with what you had to say, and I love the idea that we can make a deep end a bit shallower. Yeah, and the stuff around reflective practice, when we were delivering empowered conversations with care home staff, that was the bit I got most excited about. So when they would come back every week and they would share what they'd changed, what had worked, what hadn't worked, so that whole trial and error, and that is so important. Right, okay, so we've got our first few questions. So Joy has said, do you think that there are any amount of training can't make the carer empathetic? Or do you think that any amount, okay. Do you think that any amount of training can't make the carer empathetic, added to the low pay? I've had personal experience of abuse in care homes and geriatric wards.
I think in any workplace, and I think it matters much more when you're talking about a care home, because people's lives are on the line and people's happiness are on the line. I think you have a group of people who will be brilliant whatever the circumstances, and if they can't be brilliant, they will find a way to get out of that situation. And you will have a group of people who will probably be pretty terrible whatever the situation is. And what you need to do is create an environment that identifies them quickly and gets them out of there. I think there is a group in the middle that swings either way, and that is where not necessarily training, but training along with the environment that is around them, the colleagues, the management, the structure of work, all those sorts of things become really important, because they will swing people one way or the other. And I know certainly through, not just in that study, but all my contact throughout the years with people has taught me that there is that group. And I think that's even more so in a low paid profession, because the reality is for a lot of people, they can't just get up and leave their job. Even if they don't like what's going on there, they are stuck there because bills have got to be paid. And, you know, we need to be working with those people to make them really good at their jobs, because, you know, they're in a tough situation too. So I don't think training's a panacea at all, but I think you can create a situation that helps people be good at what they're doing.
Brilliant.
I think that's just a question, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think you did, absolutely. I'm sure Phil's smiling. We delivered a course in a care home way back when, maybe like 4 or 5 years ago. And after we delivered the course, some of those members of staff who maybe shouldn't have been there had moved on, and the whole culture and the environment, everything just changed. It was incredible to see. Your friend Chris has said, do you think this new knowledge is transferable to other colleagues in other contexts? I'm thinking about people employed to support people with dementia in wider community settings, but also workers within sports centres.
Yeah, I think it is. I think with any research, you always have to be careful about kind of wholesale just lifting something to another. But I think recognising things like that learning doesn't happen just in the classroom, it happens in what you're doing, that relationships and communication are what are going to make the difference. I think there are some principles that could quite easily be transferred across. I think the same could be said to informal caring relationships as well. So for people caring for family members or friends, recognizing that actually, you know, we learn what we're going to do in those situations in those informal ways as well. Having, you know, training and expert support can be helpful, but also recognizing that doing what makes the person smile is a pretty good way of learning what's the right thing to do.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, Emma Arnold has said, how as an outsider do you best have conversations with carers managers who are always rushed off their feet? What language angle is best when talking to them about benefits of something they maybe think they haven't got time for, like reflecting?
That's a really good question. And I think it's certainly, as a researcher, it's not necessarily a discussion I would be having, simply because I think you do have to pick your time and your role. Giving people unsolicited advice is very rarely helpful. But I think as an educator and trainer, it's a thing I often have to do. And I think you have to be careful about making sure that that's not a challenge or too much of a challenge for people, because I think if you do go in sort of confronting people, that can often get defences up. I think the second thing I would always bear in mind is to take people beyond the superficial defence that they're sort of presenting and actually talk people through the steps. There's usually a reason why people are worried, you know, it is because they're rushed off their feet. So if we can get them to talk about, you know, what is it that's taking your time, all those sorts of things, you can often get people to realise that maybe one of the things that takes their time is that there's somebody who is constantly opening the alarmed front door because they're desperate to get out of the building. And actually, maybe if somebody had spent 15 minutes with them 3 hours ago, you wouldn't have had to go to the door 20 times in the last 3 hours. I think it's sort of helping people go through those steps rather than simply challenging them that they need to go through those steps, if that makes sense. And everybody's different, so the solution you might use with different people is different.
Yeah, I think nudges are always better than just a little nudge over towards something. Margaret has said, thank you so much. How do you deal with or anticipate dealing with the argument that it's too expensive having staff sitting around, i.e. being with the residents?
And yes, it's an argument you hear all the time. It would be quite similar to my answer to the previous one. I would say, okay, that's fair enough. Let's do a bit of calculation then, shall we? Let's look at what time, what stuff you think is being wasted. And let's look at what's being gained or potentially what's being wasted when we don't do that. You know, an example I will always use is someone who, for want of 5 minutes of a member of staff relaxing them, calming down, has fallen out of bed and is now, there's an hour and a half with an ambulance, with 3 members of care staff, with calls to family, and, you know, and then 3 months later coming back from hospital unable to walk, all those sorts of things, when actually for 5 minutes that problem would have been solved. But you do have to create space for people to be able to have those thoughts. And when we're caught in that frame that's got to keep doing, that's when people don't. And that is one of the areas where training is really helpful, is that it does create that space for people to not have to worry about the doorbell ringing and actually to focus on this problem.
Yeah, definitely. So Phil has asked, did you see things happen in either of the care homes that booked the general trend in either?
Oh yes, yeah, absolutely. And I would say that's true. I do a lot of observations, a lot of research in care homes. So I would say that's true in every single care home that I've done observations in, is that you'll generally be able to say, you know, I'll put this home somewhere on that spectrum from doing really well to struggling. But in every single home, there will always be something that bucks the trend, either good or bad. And I think the message that teaches us is that you're never done with person-centred care. And equally, you never give up on person-centred care, that actually there is always somewhere that you can nudge it forward, and there is always somewhere where it can start to slip back, and that you have to constantly keep on top of it to make that change happen.
Brilliant. Thank you, Izzie. So we are at 3 o'clock. That hour has just gone by like that. Thank you so much, Izzie, for your time. It's been brilliant that you've been part of the conversation with, and I know we're going to carry on the conversations over the next few months about maybe working together. Thanks everyone for coming along. Thanks everyone for the lovely comments at the beginning. That was beautiful.
Yes. Can I just say, Emma, my email address is on the slides. So if there's any questions that we didn't have time to answer because I nattered on, just fire them off on an email. That's absolutely fine.
I think we got through them all because Phil made his question easier. So we got through every single question, which was brilliant.
Thank you, Phil.
So thank you, Izzie. Next week, we have a conversation with Jen Batt and Georgina Charles from the UCL. And they're going to be looking at who to tell, how and when after a diagnosis of dementia. So that's going to be another really interesting seminar. We're 1 minute past. Sorry, everyone, we've gone over by 1 minute. Thanks, Izzie, and we'll carry on chatting. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a lovely Wednesday. Thank you. See you later.